Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heale, the Spectator's political correspondent and your host this week. Coming up on the show, police cars in France have been set alight, bin men are striking and protesters are violently clashing with police. Jonathan Miller and Andrew Neil will be joining me to discuss the backlash to Macron's pension reforms. Back in the UK, Humza Yousaf was narrowly elected the leader of the SNP. What challenges does he now face? I'll be speaking to Iain Macwhirter. In Westminster this week, Tories are siding with the SNP over an MP suspension. Refugees could soon move from hotels to ships, and Corbyn won't be standing for Labour at the next election. Katy Balls will be joining us to talk through it all. Should MPs have second jobs? An undercover sting showed Matt Hancock trying to charge £10,000 a day for a fake consultancy. Douglas Murray will be sharing his thoughts on the crisis of confidence facing our Parliament. And finally, the campaigner Posie Parker writes for this week's magazine about a tour down under. She'll be on the show to tell us all about it. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. And if you want to read more from The Spectator, then why not subscribe to the magazine? For just £12 you can get 12 weeks in print and online and a free £20 Amazon voucher. Just go to www.spectator.co.uk/TV offer to subscribe. First up, Spectator contributor Jonathan Miller writes this week's cover piece about Macron's pension reforms. Why is he so desperate to pass them? Jonathan joins me now with the Spectator's chairman, Andrew Neil. This week in the Spectator magazine, Jonathan Miller writes about the protests in France. I'm joined now by Jonathan and the chairman of the Spectator, Andrew Neil. Welcome both. Jonathan, first question, has Macron gone too far?
Well, I think Macron is showing in his second term his weaknesses from his first term, which is, he's actually right about what ails France. He came into office with a great reforming agenda, but he just annoys everybody. The first time around, he increased the tax on diesel fuel while suppressing the wealth tax. That started the Gilets jaunes movement, which really only petered out with COVID. And now he's kind of doing it all over again. He's pushing the reform of the pension agenda, and he's right to do so. And he's meanwhile, continuing to manifest the Marie Antoinette quality of hiding his wristwatch. Mine is not a €4,000 wristwatch, just to be clear.
Andrew, Jonathan says Macron's right to go ahead with these reforms. And it seems, largely common sense, having a retirement age of 62. But ironically, public polling is against him. You've got a lot of students who'll have to pay the debts of these things for decades to come. How has Macron got it so spectacularly wrong? And why doesn't he seem able to communicate his message clearly?
Well, since we're in a mood of full disclosure, I have got a watch which is at least €4,000, probably a lot more.
You're a white colonialist.
It's a gift from my wife, who is half Persian, so be careful what you say. And I'm not taking it off. In fact, I'm rather proud of it. But then I'm not president of France. Look, Jonathan's cover story at The Spectator this week, which is superb and has actually a brilliant cover based on Tintin as well, which is very funny. It makes two very strong points. One is that French pensions do need to be reformed. There's no way the French state can continue to afford the level of pensions it pays with everybody retiring. Well, with people retiring at the latest 62, train drivers retire earlier than that, air traffic controllers retire earlier than that, all in a pretty good whack as well. Pensions account for 14% of French GDP as it is. That will rise. It's way above even the European average. So he's right to go down this road. Previous presidents have made some changes too. Sarkozy made some changes. Even Hollande, the socialist president, made some changes. The problem is the one that Jonathan alludes to, is that this reform wouldn't be nearly so unpopular if it wasn't being proposed by President Macron. He just does seem to have the ability to wind people up, even when he's right. And it goes back to the whole Je suis Jupiter, I am God of gods. He is very grand. He makes our royal family look quite common, actually. Though he can't be happy with the king being in the Bundestag today. And I think it's a great pity in a way, because he's right. It will have to be done by somebody, but he struggles to carry public opinion with them. So that's why at the moment you've got this standoff.
And Jonathan, obviously, you cited public polling. There's obviously the protesters who are getting all the, the pictures and the films. Is there not some kind of section of the French public, maybe not a silent majority, but certainly a sizable minority, which agrees with him and accepts this? Or is this just seen as a sort of elite project?
Well, there are some people in France who agree with him, although they don't particularly want to identify with him personally. He never really has received the love or adulation of the French people. He was elected on both occasions, mainly because people thought the alternative of Marine Le Pen was actually worse. He had no native political party. He has no great core of support outside the media, where he's had a lot of support, and foreign journalists have loved him. The Economist had him on their cover walking on water. The New York Times thinks he's the greatest thing since sliced baguette. But no, he doesn't have a huge. I mean, people who ought to know better in France just have not had it explained to them how people are living longer. And somebody's got to pay for these generous retirements. I mean, even high school students are demonstrating against this reform when they don't seem to have cottoned onto that. It's them who's going to spend their entire working lives paying for Jacques, my friend down at the allotments in my village, who retired at 51 and gets 2,500 euros. He's a railway guy. He gets 2,500 euros a month and could well be drawing that for 30 years. Well, unfortunately, somebody's got to pay for that. I mean, I'm very happy for Jacques. He's a very happy guy, and that's great. But somewhere they've got to stop binging and deal with the bill, which they simply refuse to do.
Andrew, you mentioned there about Macron's sort of Jupiter complex. Do you think that's why he thought he could succeed when so many sort of efforts to change this, mostly Jacques Chirac in 1995, did he think he could succeed where others had failed because of hubris, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think he thinks he can do things that other presidents have not been able to do. But he hasn't prepared the ground very well for it. There was an argument to be won here. Of course, it's all been exacerbated by the fact he hasn't got a majority in the French Parliament and the National Assembly, and so could only get it through by exercising the executive powers created by de Gaulle in 1958, this famous clause 49.3 of the French Constitution, which allowed him to push it through basically by executive fiat. And of course, that added, therefore, a lack of sort of democratic legitimacy has added to the demonstrations. But I think it's pretty clear. There's a good report in the online by the Spectator by Gavin Mortimer from the demonstrations on Tuesday. He was with them in Paris. They didn't seem to be nearly on the same scale as the previous week. And there isn't another one coming up till April the 6th, which will be next week. And I think it'd be interesting to see if there is momentum or whether actually they're beginning to tail off a little bit. That actually they're not becoming on a scale that forced President Chirac, to turn back in 1995 after he had won both the presidency and the National Assembly by a landslide. The president is in the Les Hautes Alpes today, which isn't all that far from where I'm talking to you from. He's visiting a reservoir because there's a major water shortage problems developing in this region. There are already water controls here, and March isn't even out yet. So he's trying to say it's business as usual. He was met by some demonstrators, but not by that many. I guess he'll be waiting to see what happens through April to see if there is momentum which will make the protests irresistible, or whether actually they're going to fade out. The one thing that puzzles me, maybe Jonathan can shed some light on this, is that what did for Chirac in 95 is that the unions basically brought the country to a halt. Everything stopped. It was like the effect of a general strike, and it was indefinite. They just carried on until Chirac gave in. The unions, actually true in Britain as well, the unions in Britain and definitely now in France, they don't seem to do that. They go on strike for a while, they cause disruption, then they go back to work again, which kind of mitigates the impact they're really having.
Meanwhile, of course, the air traffic controllers who've been causing disruption right across Europe are still planning to continue the disruption. Whether Macron can win technically on points this battle or not, I think that what I conclude in this piece is that he has succeeded really in uniting most of the French against him. He doesn't have a lot of political capital to persuade the French to bend to his will. I think he's going to be spending a lot more time posturing on the international stage. But the question really now needs to be raised is whether Jupiter's presidency is a failure. And unless he can pull some kind of remarkable rabbit out of his hat, or rat out of his hat, given what's happening in Paris, I just don't see where he goes henceforth. I think he's a sort of a somewhat helpless figure who has failed to carry the French along with him, and I think there's nothing much he can do to change his personality. He may be brilliant, he may be right, but people are not convinced by him, and I don't see that changing.
And Jonathan, if Macron does fail, who stands to benefit from that? You write in your piece about Marine Le Pen, who's sort of been indulging in some of the economic unreality of this and agreeing with the pensioners, but keeping quite sort of moderate rhetoric. Who, if Macron is seen as a failure, who will run against that record next time?
Well, I think the immediate evident beneficiary is Marine Le Pen, who's played, to me, a surprisingly smart game. She hasn't been hysterical. She's on the wrong side of the pension reform. She wants to actually lower it to 60, which is economically suicidal. But she's not issuing blood-curdling threats. So she's an immediate beneficiary. It's hard you can look around the horizon. There's a lot of people want Macron's job. There's Edouard Philippe, the former prime minister. Maybe he's credible. But unfortunately, the talent on the bench here is not that impressive. And it doesn't look like there's anybody willing to step forward and lead France to renewed glory at the moment, which is why it's sort of a sad situation for France that they're caught between this kind of inability to accept reality and a political system that is not really responding to the needs of the country or convincing voters of a way forward.
Faced with all that, Andrew, do you think Macron's going to press on, mount a climb down, which we've seen so many politicians do before, or do you reckon that he's going to carry on with these reforms and thinking he's not going to run again and press on come what may?
Well, I think that if the unions succeeded in bringing the country to a halt, as they did under President Chirac, he would have to find some way of backing down because chaos would result. If the unions and their supporters carry on the way they're going at the moment, he could actually scrape through this and can continue. As I say, he's trying to give an impression of business as usual. There are issues at stake here of which France illustrates, but go way beyond France and speak to all of Europe. I mean, the harsh reality is that European welfare states, European social democracies, are now kept afloat on a massive sea of red ink. The welfare state survives by borrowing now. That's how it does it. If you at the outer extreme, you've got Greece, whose national debt is over 170% of its GDP. If you think that's ever going to be paid back, I've got a bridge to sell you. Italy's over 130%. France, the biggest economy after Germany, is 113%. The only one that is anywhere near the Maastricht criteria, which I remind our viewers, is that debt should not be more than 60% of GDP. That's supposed to be the rules of the European single currency, is Germany. So you've got this massive sea of red ink keeping the welfare state afloat, and few places to go. In France, the state now spends almost 60% of GDP. I mean, does anybody think spending even more which is what keeping the current pension system would be, will make France a more competitive society? I don't think so. I mean, I guess you could go to 100%. What you get then is the Soviet Union, that well-known, innovative, insurgent, dynamic economy. You want to put taxes up? Well, French taxes are already the highest of any major economy in Europe. And I think France is bordered by 7 countries. It's quite easy for French people to get into their cars, onto a plane, onto a train, and scoot out of the country, which is what they did when previous presidents tried to put taxes even higher than they are at the moment. So you could say not just France, but all of Europe at the moment is between a rock and a hard place on this. They can't really borrow anymore. They can't really increase state spending anymore unless they want to destroy what dynamism is left in their economies, which in many cases isn't very much. And they can't increase taxes by anymore because that's pretty much at a high level too. The French situation, and France illustrates all of the above on a large scale, is also that the politics of it aren't that great, because the price of the rise of Macron, who, and I'm reminded of Jonathan saying that The Economist said he could walk on water. The Economist also put Angela Merkel on the cover and said she was the new leader of the free world. How has that played out? It's why I think more and more people have been turning from The Economist to The Spectator. That speaks for itself on that. But the price of the rise of Macron has been the destruction of the mainstream right and the mainstream left. So if, as Mr. Chirac did, if he was to call parliamentary elections, I think, again, as Jonathan alluded to it, the main beneficiaries would be the extreme left and the extreme right, particularly the extreme right. Both the extreme left and the extreme right are against the pension reforms. So there isn't even a political way out of this either, which is why France is interesting. I mean, our own Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, he's delayed raising the pension age again. The reason people should watch carefully what's happening in France is because it is important that the issues are alive all over Europe like this at the moment. They're just at their most acute in France for now.
Fascinating portent from Paris. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jonathan. Back home, Humza Yousaf was elected as Nicola Sturgeon's successor this week. How has he started his reign as Scotland's First Minister and the SNP party leader? Spectator contributor Iain Macwhirter joins me now. Iain, Humza Yousaf won with just over 52% of the vote in a very split party. Surely this is the sort of dream result that unionists were hoping for?
Yeah, from a unionist point of view, this is exactly how they'd have liked it to play. The SNP, the divisions emerged during the course of this leadership campaign, but no one quite realised how profound these divisions actually are. And we can see that in the result. Kate Forbes getting nearly half the vote. Remember, she was up against Humza Yousaf, who had the entire resources of the Scottish National Party and indeed the government behind him. He was a continuity candidate. He was the chosen candidate by Nicola Sturgeon. He was the one that they wanted in there. And it became a profound shock that Kate Forbes, who of course opposes many of the so-called progressive pieces of legislation that Humza Yousaf is determined to proceed with, like the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, it was a profound shock to the SNP to discover that she was able to command such a support from the membership. And also, I think unionists will be well pleased with hearing what was said, really not just between the lines, but on the lines during this campaign by all three candidates, one way or the other, that independence is not going to happen in the near future, that the argument has not been properly made, that they need to win over no voters. And that just makes the case for the UK government to say, well, yeah, now is not the time for another independence referendum. You basically said it yourself. Go away and think again.
Of course, unionist is one label, and there's this big divide in Scottish politics, unionist versus nationalist. But there's also the two main unionist parties, the Conservatives and Labour. How would you describe this result as impacting upon their chances? For instance, some Conservatives spoke to were delighted with Humza Yousaf, but they're worried now about the impact it'll have for Labour. And Labour also, potentially would have wanted Kate Forbes as a socially conservative candidate, which might have given them a bit more space on the left. Talk us through the kind of prospect for both two main unionist parties now that Humza Yousaf is the First Minister.
Yeah, it is strange, isn't it, that both the unionist parties would have preferred the socially conservative Kate Forbes as First Minister rather than Humza Yousaf. And of course, the main reason there is that they both regard Humza Yousaf as a weak candidate. He was famously given a dressing down by Kate Forbes during the campaign, saying he couldn't make the trains run on time. He lost the plot with the police. He's the worst. He was the worst health minister that the SNP has had, and she said she would sack him as soon as she won, if she won. So he is a lame duck First Minister even before he took office. As for the election prospects, well, Labour obviously are looking now to recover seats next year at the general election. They can say now Scots have a choice. Nicola Sturgeon always said the reason we need independence is because Scotland keeps getting Tory governments for which we do not vote. And now this time they have a chance to vote for a Labour government, to vote to get the Tories out of Westminster. So there's going to be a tremendous, I think, a very strong motivation on many voters on the kind of social democratic soft left in Scotland who will say, well, this time, we've been voting SNP for a few years now. This time we're going to go vote to Labour because we want to get the Tories out. And remember, Labour, Labour had 41 out of 59 seats in Scotland as recently as 2010. So there is a history of Labour voting here, particularly Labour voting in UK elections, which they could well reconnect with. Now they say they're going to get 20 seats. That's probably a bit optimistic, but that would be I think if they get into double figures at the next election, that will be a serious blow to Humza Yousaf and the new regime in house, because here's Labour basically doing the progressive agenda and getting votes for it. As for the Tories, they're in a very difficult position. I mean, they are relieved that they're not up against Kate Forbes, mainly because Kate Forbes was a strong candidate, and she kind of talked on Tory territory because she was saying, progressive legislation is all very well, but you've got to get the economy right. You've got to support. You've got to talk to business. Humza Yousaf, his cabinet, he's completely wiped out the Kate Forbes faction. There are no representatives, not even her campaign manager, Ivan McKee, who was the business secretary. Even he's been effectively ousted. By being given, demeaning job opportunities. So they're right out in the back benches. The SNP is very obviously divided now, and the Tories can, they would hope to be able to pick up on the kind of themes that Kate Forbes put out during the campaign and use them in their own election pitches. But I don't think they're going to get much traction in the next election, because I think it's all going to be about getting a Labour victory in Westminster. So I don't think they're going to make much. Perhaps in the next Scottish parliamentary elections, a couple of years on, that might be an opportunity for them then.
So more 2026 then.
2026, yeah, because I think everyone expects that Humza Yousaf is going to have a series of failures. He's going to persevere with this legal action against Section 35 of the Scotland Act, under which the Gender Recognition Act was blocked by the UK government on the grounds that it conflicted with the equality legislation. And he knocked from pillar to post of this, because at times he said, well, I'd take the legal advice and I wouldn't persevere with this if I thought it was going to be futile. Then he turns around and the first thing he says, the second thing he says when he's installed as First Minister, he's going to take the UK government to court, even though everybody knows it would be a failure. The second thing, or rather, his first pronouncement, of course, was he said, I'm going to demand a Section 30 order to get an independence referendum within hours of becoming First Minister. So what did he do? He lifted up the phone to number 10 and asked for it, and they said, no, I don't think so. And he said, what could he say? So he's moved on. So already you can see there's going to be a pattern of failures here, or problems, with a background of economic failure, which the Tories, I think, will probably be able to make. Because remember, the Tories are the opposition party in Holyrood, and I think they'll be able to make something of that probably by the time of the 2026 elections, if the Kate Forbes faction is still so isolated. because then the Tories could conceivably win back support in the northeast of Scotland, the oil industry. Remember, Humza Yousaf's very pro-green here. He's very opposed to oil and gas industry. Tories could pick up votes there, and possibly even in Highland constituencies.
I mean, you mentioned Kate Forbes there, and there's an analogy which Katy has drawn in her column, which is about Humza Yousef appointing a cabinet of loyalists, a bit like Liz Truss, of course, and sort of all was a very loyal cabinet. And the danger was, of course, it sort of formed a rival court, a sort of king over the water, as it were. Do you think there's perhaps a chance that Kate Forbes and Ivan McKee and some of those who are less enthusiastic about, say, the party machine within the Parliament can sort of cause any sort of mischief or problems to Humza Yousef, either in the short term or over the next couple of years until the Scottish elections?
Well, I think they will, but I don't think they immediately will form some kind of rival political party. There already is one, remember, in Scotland. There's Alba, there's Alex Salmond's party. But now, he's always going to be in the sidelines here. He's risen to prominence again during this campaign. But that is, I think there will be the Forbes 48 percenters, if you like, will not want to appear to be allied with another political party. So I think they'll be very cautious about that. However, they don't really need to do very much. They can allow, she's made her pitch very clear. She won this very substantial support, and everyone knows what she stands for. So she can watch, from the back benches as Humza Yousaf, collides with these obstacles, and doesn't really need to say anything or organize anything in particular for the medium term. Obviously, when it comes to 2026, things might look very different. Some people are comparing Humza Yousaf to Liz Truss and thinking he might not even be there by that time. I think that's probably a bit fanciful. I think he should be around for a bit at least, but it's going to be a rocky road.
Yeah, we'll see in 49 days' time if that proves to be correct. Of course, Humza Yousaf is facing now his first electoral challenge in the fact of the likely by-election in Margaret Ferrier's constituency in West Hamilton. Margaret Ferrier has been given a 30-day suspension today by the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons. It'll likely go to a vote of MPs, and thereafter you need to get 10% of constituents for a by-election. If there is such a contest, which may be sort of 3 or 4 months away, Labour obviously were only sort of 5,000 votes behind last time. Surely Anna Sarwar and Scottish Labour are now very much looking forward to the chance of taking on Humza in this seat and potentially winning.
Another Hamilton by-election. No, I don't know. They will be. They will be hoping that they can make progress here. I'm not sure it's going to be as easy as that. The SNP is quite dug into these constituencies and has been for a long time. But they will. Particularly if there are some incidents that take place in the next few weeks, some setbacks to Humza Yousaf. There is, you detect a frustration with a number of the ways in which he's conducted himself, not least holding this prayer meeting in the state rooms at Bute House on the night he was installed as First Minister. A lot of people just think, well, it's a very strange thing to do. It's like holding a prayer meeting in, the cabinet room in number 10. It's not something that you really do. You try to keep some kind of distance between faith and politics. And this appeared to be bringing faith right into the centre of government in Scotland. And a number of people have been very uneasy about that. And, a number of other religious faiths in Scotland. I don't speak from personal knowledge here because I'm an atheist, but a number of other church leaders have said they were very concerned about the way in which Kate Forbes was demonized for being a Christian, while Humza Yousef was his adherence to what is a socially conservative faith somehow was glossed over and avoided. So I think you'll find Catholic communities in West Central Scotland who are traditionally vote Labour will be slightly uneasy about this. I think I don't know if that's going to make them vote against the SNP, but it's there's already a sense that Humza Yousef is not a secure, safe pair of hands in the way that his predecessor Nicola Sturgeon was, and that's the thing. Everyone's going to make that comparison.
Yes. Finally, just to conclude, Ian, in her column, Katy ends by saying Unionists now have a golden chance to press their cause in the year ahead. Do you agree with that assessment? And if they do have a golden chance, how best to exploit it?
Well, they do have a golden chance, and as I was saying, I think for the 2024 election, I think they have a very good chance, particularly Labour has an extremely good opportunity to show that it still is relevant politically in Scotland. And the SNP has been so dominant under Nicola Sturgeon, ever since 2015 when they won, 56 seats out of 59, and Labour was reduced to 1 seat. They still have more MSPs in the Scottish Parliament than all the unionist parties combined, and more MPs than all the unionist parties combined. So, Scots, SNP is very, very dug in electorally in Scotland. I mean, they dominate politics at every level. But this is an opportunity for Labour in 2024 to say that actually voting Labour does matter, because you can actually change that. You can change the character of government in Westminster. You can change the UK. Vote for us. If you vote for the SNP, nothing's going to happen. Vote for us, and we'll kick the Tories out. So that's going to be that's going to be their opportunity. Whether they can take it or not is another matter, because the parties have been, because they've been down so long, they don't really know what, it looks like up to them. There really are, the opposition parties have been hollowed out in the last decade of SNP rule.
Well, thank you very much for that, Iain. Hey. And now, to give us the latest from Westminster, I'm joined by our political editor, Katy Balls. Last week, Katy, the big story, of course, was that Privileged Committee hearing on the Wednesday afternoon. And there's an interesting kind of sequel to that in something that's happened today. Talk us through the 30-day suspension that's been handed out by the Privileges Committee to Margaret Ferrier.
So this is the former SNP who I think infamously went on a trip during lockdown while having COVID, and then was found out to have travelled and therefore broken the rules. And it's pretty steep punishment, I think partly because it is quite a serious offence, and the report is pretty damning, saying that Margaret Ferrier was ultimately alleged she was dishonest in various points in terms of, this wasn't a blip of a mistake, it was an active, decision. And therefore it's going for a 30-day suspension. Now, as you allude to, what is interesting is there are 3 Conservative MPs, judging on this, who do not agree with the 30-day suspension and suggested it should be smaller. We're talking single figures, which would, of course, mean that she would not be suspended from Parliament to the level which could trigger a recall petition that could then trigger a by-election. Now, have these Tories suddenly become SNP supporters, or at least Margaret Ferrier independent now supporters, and they want to prevent this by-election, which could be quite good for Labour? Do they just think that the rest of the committee is completely wrong and actually it's quite a light offence? Or are they worried about precedent? Because, of course, these MPs are also judging Boris Johnson when it comes to Partygate and whether he misled.
Did your old boss, Boris Johnson, mislead Parliament?
You can see that perhaps they don't want to get behind this very long suspension in the sense that if they were to set a precedent for then agreeing a very long suspension or making it seem stranger were they to object to a long suspension for Boris Johnson. And I think it does feed into something we were talking about last week on the podcast, on SpectatorTV, and writing in the magazine, which is most Tory MPs want to avoid a Boris Johnson by-election like the plague.
Ironically.
And they do not think that this is good news for the party. Even those people who really do not like Boris Johnson and the Tory party, the idea of a by-election continuing the Boris Johnson circus, and also potentially leading either to the Tories losing a seat or an enhanced Boris Johnson, neither are particularly appetising to this 10 Downing Street.
Yes, you have to wonder which side Rishi Sunak be campaigning on in that by-election.
I think I have no choice. But.
And so with the 30-day suspension, it's now going to be voted on by the House of Commons. That seems almost inevitable it's going to pass. The majority which Margaret Ferrier had at the last election was just over 5,000. Scottish Labour must be licking their lips at the prospect of a win there.
Yeah, and of course, with the election this week of Humza Yousaf as the new First Minister of Scotland and SNP leader, it means he's going into an immediate challenge, a test of his, I suppose, authority. Now, I think because he has had quite a significant role in Nicola Sturgeon's government, you can't say, this is nothing to do with me, what the result comes. So it'll be an interesting test as to whether Scottish Labour, is making these inroads, where public satisfaction with the SNP is, after quite a bruising contest. Because also, there is something there which is, it's obviously been a difficult contest for the SNP. But at the same time, I think there's now so much expectation that Scottish Labour are going to make huge inroads, there's also quite a lot of pressure on Labour to show that they can deliver that.
And one of the other big stories that's been dominating this week has been migration again. And the big news here was on Wednesday when Robert Jenrick came to the House of Commons and outlined what was going to happen to migrants in hotels, and they've been moved out. The plan is now for land sites. Talk us through the kind of dynamics of that, Katie.
Yeah, so boats have been back in the news for a few reasons. So first, the illegal migration bill was back in the Commons this week, and there was lots of talk of rebellions. In the end, I think Number 10, the Whip's office, managed to talk down both sides, but by doing that, have given concessions. So looking at legal routes for some coming over. At the moment, previously it was just, we will think about some legal routes in the future. I think that would be toughened up so as to make more routes. And then also those on the right of the party wanting, stronger wording in the bill towards being able to ultimately limit the control of judges when it comes to the ECHR about how these orders work. Now, that's all bubbling along. As you say, the thing that's potentially more controversial this week is actually where are asylum seekers when they come here staying. Now, we know that the issue of asylum seekers in hotels has become really politically potent, and it's something that lots of MPs really worry is going to be a massive electoral factor for them. And this is an effort to say we're going to be moving these people out, we're going to massively reduce the use of hotels, partly through naval bases and some talk of ferries and ships. Now, I think that what's interesting is there was already a Tory backlash to some of this, which is ultimately not in my backyard. So you have a situation where, some senior Tories who have these naval bases in the area are not comfortable or particularly pleased, to say the least, at the idea they will be, becoming like a large base for this. Yeah. But I think from the government perspective, probably annoying a lot of MPs and voters all across the country, or targeting this to areas is seen as, there is no win-win on this politically. So I think this is seen as improvement. And we're hearing a lot about potentially, offshoring in the sense of on boats, not the Rwanda scheme. Now, this is interesting because it's still to be confirmed whether it's actually going to happen. It's more a government aspiration. And there's also briefing from some government saying, well, the Home Office looked at it before, but it was so expensive. It was actually cheaper to put them in hotels. I think on this issue of small boats, it's no longer really about money in the sense, clearly money is a factor, but I think it's about how politically damaging it is. And I think paying more money to ultimately have asylum seekers on boats is seen as less politically painful than having them in hotels all across the country. I
was really struck by a line I read on Wednesday, which is that some figures in government were briefing out that saying, well, this is a fight we want to have. As you say, it's not so much about money, it's also about kind of choosing a political battle. Do the government think they can really win on this after all the promises they've had before?
So I think there's been a bit of a changing in the mood music in recent weeks, whereas there's a bit more optimism that Rishi Sunak will be able to deliver, perhaps not stop the boats full stop, but something. Now, it's still the case if you look at the expected number of how the number of crossings are rising, I think there could be some really difficult figures for the government. But what they're doing here is they've got about several different aspects that they're trying to push here. So you have, yes, the legal migration bill, you have the reduction of the use of hotels, you have this scheme of Albania to stop that, and then you also have cooperation with France. And I think that there's a sense that there is no silver bullet. But if you do all these things, and also I think there is definitely at least a look of movement from the public, of the government doing it, then but at least in the run-up to the next election, the government will be able to say, well, we are doing things and we're starting to see some progress. And I actually think the difficult thing for Labour is, I think in Downing Street and across government, if they can just get one flight to Rwanda, obviously that alone would not have a deterrent effect. But you take all these things together and you look at the fact that Labour's main attack on the Tories is simply, your schemes don't work, this is unworkable. They don't want to go near morality in the slightest. And therefore, you can start to get, just a few flights to Rwanda. I think there is a sense that this would change the mood music and mean that there's a lot more faith in the government. Now, there's been lots of, false storms, false promises, but I think that is a strategy and why people are a bit more optimistic.
And you mentioned Labour there. Of course, the big story that was dominating that party this week was Jeremy Corbyn being barred from this motion passed by the National Executive Council on Tuesday. What do you think? I mean, some people say that, Keir Starmer likes having Jeremy Corbyn there as a sort of political pinata, basically, to give a kicking and sort of distance himself from the left. What do you think Starmer's thinking on all of this is, and how likely is it that Corbyn can actually stand and pose a challenge in Islington again?
So I think it's an interesting one. We know that Keir Starmer has tried to define himself part through having a fight with his own side. I think it's part because he struggles when he gives these mission speeches to really light up the country in enthusiasm. But perhaps we just haven't seen the right mission speech yet. And therefore you have a situation whereby, ultimately when he suspended Jeremy Corbyn over, his comments on an anti-Semitism report, that was, I think, a point when actually loads around Keir Starmer think that it really helped show that Labour had changed. And banning Jeremy Corbyn, which was the vote this week, which has happened, from standing as a Labour candidate at the next election, is almost a completion of this journey. I think, will it work in the same way? I think this has the potential to be much messier. As you say, Jeremy Corbyn has hinted he could stand as an independent. It's not so much, if you think about, Islington North, it's a very safe seat. So it's not so much that Jeremy Corbyn might win. I think that seems unlikely. And I also think, it's not so the Tories will really go through the middle there. I would be surprised. But I think it's an interesting question as to if, in the lead up to the general election, there was quite a messy situation where Jeremy Corbyn's campaigning as an independent. There are quite a few Labour members who support Jeremy Corbyn still, particularly the younger Labour voters, saying, evil Keir Starmer, stopping this, no democracy in the Labour Party. And then you have your Labour candidate who's been vetted. Is that something where everyone says, well, great Keir Starmer, you pushed this guy to the side? Or does it just remind people of Labour civil wars? And I think the jury is out right now on whether this will, be a boon to Keir Starmer or actually quite tricky.
Fascinating question, which we'll continue to debate. Thank you for joining me, Katie. Douglas Murray writes in this week's magazine about MPs having second jobs. It follows a sting by the campaign group led by donkeys who tried to trap MPs into agreeing to do consultancy work for a fake South Korean company. To explain what happened and to make sense of it, Douglas joins me now. Hello, and thank you for joining us, Douglas. You've written your column this week on MPs' second jobs. Tell us what exactly inspired that one.
Well, there's several things. One is, of course, it's a perennial subject in British politics. It's a question of whether or not MPs can or should have second jobs. It's a perennial discussion because it's sort of clear and unclear. The clear thing is, of course, being an MP clearly isn't a full-time job. Otherwise, people couldn't join the cabinet or the shadow cabinet. On the other hand, it seems that there are certain jobs, mainly money-making jobs, which people don't appreciate MPs taking. And then the more sort of urgent thing is the release this week of footage by the campaigning group led by donkeys, which was a sort of classic tabloid sting of various MPs. This group pretended to be a South Korean company looking for people to sit on its sort of advisory board and be paid very large sums of money to do very little. It's a sort of perfect job for a certain type of MP. And led by donkeys found a number of MPs who were very eager to continue conversations with this alleged firm, pretend firm. And I say in the column, I think it's sort of, there's a sort of pattern to the people who fell for it. A number of people didn't. But the people who sort of fell for it and got into discussions about money included Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng. And I think there's a deeper lesson somewhere underneath this.
Yes, and you make the point, I think, in your column about actually this is a cultural problem, which is that it's not just necessarily about sort of greed or wanting money. It's also, I think, a deeper problem of purpose. And I think that was really the sense I got from reading it. I mean, explain, is there a sort of vacuum there? I mean, traditionally, 50 years ago, MP was a very highly publicly esteemed position. Do you think now that sort of MPs are trying to find their role in a modern 21st century age?
Well, I think that is part of the point. Is I say that there's an issue of hope. An unkind person might say ambition in politics. The hope is that when somebody's a bag carrier to a minister, they hope that someday it's worth carrying the bag because someday they will have a person to carry the bag for them, and what heaven that would be. The point is, in a way, this keeps people on the straight and narrow. The one thing that unites all 650 MPs is the delusion that at some point the country will call for them. Actually, we've got through prime ministers at such a rate in recent years that it's not such a delusion anymore. And there are certain figures like Jeremy Corbyn who might suggest that actually, maybe even the most maniacal backbencher might one day be called to lead their party, if not their country. So, but that's the one thing that unites all MPs is this sort of belief that maybe at some point they'll get to the top job. The interesting thing about the sting as it affected Hancock and Kwarteng was these are two men who clearly recognize that there is very little future for them. And the old ways for them to, and this isn't to by any means to excuse the behavior, but I think it's just interesting that in the past, they might have thought that they would, for instance, if they even didn't get continuing in ministerial office, they would end up on a board of some company. I suggest in the most charitable way possible that very few banks would want Kwasi Kwarteng on their board. Very few hedge funds would like to advertise that they have him as one of their advisors. So people like him become slightly desperate. And there's an interesting thing underneath this, which is that I think that as the Conservative government dwindles in the next year or two, we will see a lot more of this. It's completely predictable that when people want an out from politics, they become rather desperate. And then there's the question underneath the question you asked, which is perhaps also they realize that far from having been a boon to their CV, having been an MP actually doesn't help them at all. Quite the contrary. It's a bit of a problem for them. Well, that's happened in our lifetimes. The move from MPs being people who we respect and whose name you might want on your masthead to people who are derided and actually thought less of because of their time in the House of Commons. It's a very strange development, but it has happened. And I think that we are seeing sort of sting operations of a kind of old-fashioned tabloid kind, and we'll see more of them.
Do you reckon so with the new technology which Zoom provides where you can have anyone filming it? And of course, we also saw in Partygate, the fact that there were Zoom screenshots of this dreadful December 2020 COVID quiz as well.
Yes, absolutely. The worst party of all time. I mean, this is all part of the interconnected age. There was a time, even just 10 years ago, when somebody like the fake sheikh of the News of the World would, invite somebody like Sarah Ferguson to come to a room at the Dorchester and produce a handful of cash and ask her to speak more clearly into the briefcase. And that was a sort of classic tabloid sting. One of the things that was interesting about the Le Bidonki sting was that this was sort of Zoom job interviews where Kwarteng and Hancock and others, including Gavin Williamson, doing his best attempt at being a human being, sort of tried to sort of audition effectively, and it was a pretty grotesque spectacle. But it was different from the old school tabloid stings. I mean, they actually thought they were in a job interview, and we saw a sort of job interview live. It made it particularly pitiable.
I agree. And I mean, some of those lines, Matt Hancock, £10,000 sterling. I mean, it sounds very sort of Mr. Big, the Italian job kind of thing.
As I say in the piece, I don't think Matt Hancock's been paid £10,000 sterling or anything else a day other than when he was in the jungle. I think his non-jungle rate is probably a percentage of that.
Douglas, we all find our places, don't we?
And as for poor old Kwasi Kwarteng, I mean, one gets a clearer and clearer view of what happened and went wrong in his chancellorship when he says $10,000, and then they say sterling, dollars or sterling. Since Kwasi Kwarteng was chancellor, these things are pretty much in parity. So maybe Maybe he realized that. And then, of course, he says, well, I mean, when I say $10,000 a month, what I'm talking about is a ballpark. And then the interviewer says, well, we're thinking of 8,000 to 12,000 a day. And he says, well, I think we're kind of close to a deal there. I mean, this is like profoundly embarrassing stuff for them. But I do think there's this deeper lesson underneath it, which is this: we do have for good reasons in Britain, we have a suspicion of MPs wanting to make themselves rich, at the same time as having this sort of rather sadistic feeling that they should do nothing to advance themselves outside of the House of Commons. And I think that is an oddity in Britain. We are talking, it's always interesting that we are talking in Britain about a sort of controversial point, but we are talking about relatively small sums of money compared to the sums of money being talked about in other democracies. For instance, America. I mean, Nancy Pelosi in the United States has become worth more than $100 million during her time in the Senate. Why? Buying stocks. Is she just particularly brilliant at trading? I would suggest not. She's had very good information over the decades, and so she's become really rich from politics. That's quite normal in American politics. In British politics, there is, by contrast, the feeling that if somebody makes a six-figure salary outside of their job as a parliamentarian, that they are absolutely beyond the pale and are doing something abominable. I don't share that. I think if they're doing something worthwhile, such as being a barrister or a QC, it's okay. But the rules on it, the reason why I say it's a perennial question is because it just keeps coming around. And Labour, of course, love it because they always pretend it's Tory sleaze. But I mean, if you're a Labour MP and you're given a hosting slot on the unlistenable LBC, for instance, and are paid a few £1,000s for it, that's okay, apparently. So, I mean, Labour are against second jobs unless it's being a loudmouth LBC presenter for a few hours and getting paid an average monthly wage for a couple of hours of shouting your gob off about things you don't know about. Barry Gardner, Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips, of course, makes huge amounts of money per hour by appearing on things like Have I Got News for You as the voice of the people. Yeah.
I mean, this is the interesting question. I think it's twofold. You conclude in your piece, you say basically there isn't a kind of intrinsic thing that makes Tories supposedly more corruptible, etc. Yeah. And there's the same temptations will apply to Labour, especially if they get into office. I mean, that's the key divide, really, is that no one for a long time, I think, perhaps wanted to have Labour's expertise because they were sort of fighting a civil war and particularly unseemly one at that. But I think it's an interesting shift that Labour has gone from being, 100 years ago, it was campaigning for MPs to be paid so the working man could get a salary at a time when the MPs' wages were unpaid, to now obviously campaigning on this issue. Do you think there's a danger perhaps that Labour is falling into this trap about having sort of second jobs in the sense of Tory second jobs, which is sort of links with banks, links with consultancies, barristers somehow, and actually a difference from the kind of educational public sector, the academic class that makes up so much of Labour's support and ranks in Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that they have an academic class in the modern Labour Party. I think that's a mistake. Would that there was an academic class in the modern Labour Party. The Labour Party would like to present this as a Tory sleaze sort of issue, and I say it's just an end of an era issue. It happened at the end of the Blair years, at the end of the Gordon Brown years. Whenever MPs start to sense that they're on the way out, that the writing's on the wall, they've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. A lot of them just leg it and try to leg it with as much cash as they can find. And that happened, as I say, at the end of the last Labour government. And it's possibly something that's happening now as it happened at the end of the Conservative government in the 90s. The Labour Party will, of course, always try to present this as being a Tory sleaze, toffs, etc., issue. But, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, Labour MPs are certainly not immune from this. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, tried to enrich himself. People don't think of this because, of course, if you there's this perception that the Tories are capitalists, and then, of course, capitalism is bad, and making money is bad, of course, in Britain, and therefore we must stop the Tories doing this. The Labour Party are perfectly open to this. Jeremy Corbyn made himself a bit richer by acting as a mouthpiece for the mullahs in Tehran, as a paid presenter on Press TV, and the Iranian government's propaganda channel got chucked off TV stations in the UK. He didn't mind that, and weirdly enough, when he did that, people didn't say, "Aha, Labour sleaze, Labour sleaze." They sort of said at best, "Oh, poor old Jeremy accidentally ended up on a channel where they do forced confessions as the next segment, and after that there's a nice evening segment of the hanging of the gays." So that everyone just sort of thought it was just a sort of mistake by Jeremy Corbyn. Whereas when the Conservatives try to make money, it's a sign of capitalist wickedness. I don't buy that. I just think, as I say, this is what happens at the fag end of governments, and there'll be more of it.
I mean, one solution which has been proposed in the page of the Spectator itself is the idea of paying MPs more, like quite considerably more. What do you think of that, Douglas?
I've always been a fan of that. It's an incredibly unpopular position, but I've always been a fan of the idea that MPs should be paid more, and the commensurate thing with that is that we should have fewer of them. We don't need 650 MPs. There's no reason why America can get by on 100 senators, and we need 650 MPs. Most MPs don't know what to do with their time. Some do good constituency business, but it's not a full-time job, and they make a nuisance of themselves a lot of the time. I think there should be fewer of them. They should be paid a lot more, and it would attract a higher caliber of person. Because, I mean, again, but a point that needs reiterating is, in our own lifetimes, the status of being an MP has changed from something that was an asset on your CV to something that arguably is something you have to excuse yourself for, rather as if you have on your record, a police report for having exposed yourself in public. It's something like that, and I think that's a shame. I think we should have good legislators. I think we should have the best. I think the best people should apply. They're clearly not, and one way to solve that is to pay what MPs we have better. I mean, there's no reason why a diversity officer in the NHS should be being paid twice as much as an MP. I think it's madness.
Well, thank you very much, Douglas, for joining us. And finally, Posie Parker writes in this week's magazine about her tour down under. She joins the show to tell us all about it. Hello, and thank you for joining us on Spectator TV, Posie. I think the first question is, given the events of the past week, how are you, and what exactly happened on your trip down under?
Oh gosh, what didn't happen on my trip down under? It was a full spectrum of experience, which started with me when I landed in Sydney, saying to my husband, we could move here. It's such a lovely, wonderful, friendly place to, by the end of it, leaving New Zealand with police protection where nobody could even know where I was in the station, and having a police escort until I got on the plane, until the plane took off. So, full spectrum of stuff, mobbing, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously done a number of these kind of events before. You've enlisted reactions, but positive, negative before. I mean, were you surprised by the intensity of feelings which happened on your tour down under?
Yes, I was. So, I knew it was going to be hostile because we are in a bizarre episode of human history in which normal people that understand the truth are fighting against sort of a quasi-religious authoritarian cult. So I knew that it was going to be difficult. But what normally happens in these situations is you get the people that are part of the cult that will be very, very angry with you and shout dogmatic mantras at you. And that's that's understandable, and that's I accept that. And they are almost invited because they prove my point, really, as to why I don't want them in women-only spaces. But once we stepped into calling me a white nationalist and a Nazi, which was done by people in authority, then I'm fair game just to be killed in the street. So it just took on a totally different feel. And also, I think most people don't want men in their spaces. They don't want men in spaces with their daughters. And so it's unlikely I'm just going to meet some random person on the street that doesn't agree with me. But, that's not the case when I'm all over the news on a daily basis, trending on a daily basis as kind of more poisonous than a funnel web spider.
But you mentioned there, talking about going around Australia and New Zealand, and you mentioned in your answer there about those in authority who let you down. Who exactly is to blame there? Because obviously there was a visceral demonstration on the streets, and you talk about in your piece, but for the explanation of those who are watching this, particularly the failings of the police in New Zealand, why do you think this is, and how exactly did they let you down?
Well, I want to just make it really clear that the officers that looked after me in New Zealand were incredible. They were lovely. They are nothing to do with the decision-making process, which basically held back police out of the place where the mobbing happened. I mean, I got taken to the middle of the mob to stand on a bandstand. And when I got there, I had no idea the police weren't there. I just assumed, because they said they cooperate. I mean, they said they wanted to know where I was before I got in the country. And so I assumed that meant they were going to protect me, and they took it really seriously because I'd been escorted in a couple of airports by Australian police. But instead, when I got there, I was searched for 2 hours and interrogated. My hotel had already cancelled. And then when I got to the hotel, when I woke up the next day, I had a threatening letter under my door. So I probably shouldn't have been surprised. And I felt it, right? I'm not particularly a spiritual person or believe in those sorts of things, but I felt it in my bones. I was very afraid actually going to the event.
And there was an activist who assaulted you by pouring tomato juice in your head, and then gave a very sort of boastful interview to television before flying to Australia, and then the police said that they wouldn't arrest them. I mean, do you think that you were sort of insufficiently supported against those kind of threats, and that clearly the people who were doing this sort of stuff felt they were empowered to do things such as cover you in tomato juice?
I think they act as if there's no consequences whatsoever, and to sort of gloat about it, especially when apparently that person has refugee status and now has committed an act of common assault, which, I'm now drinking my soup cold. So I'm quite happy about that. I think there are going to be some consequences. But yeah, the protesters should not have been allowed anywhere near women who just want to speak. I mean, it's been called a counter-protest. We are not protesting. We are just gathering to speak. And so there is a protest against women speaking all in every single city we encountered. And it just got worse and worse and worse for how much they were allowed to really terrorize women. And
I mean, Posie, you've done a lot of these kind of overseas tours and around the country as well. I mean, do you get a sense perhaps that the debate on these kind of issues is very different in Australia and New Zealand? And to what extent do you think national leaders, people like Jacinda Ardern, are to blame for clearly the very parlous and dangerous state of political debate down there?
Well, I think we just look to lockdowns, and I think there's a correlation between the authoritarian attitude of those governments in lockdown and what you can force a population to do, and this adherence to this brand new ideology of pretending that we don't know what biological sex is. There does seem to be a correlation. I just don't. It was just so weird to be in a situation that was clearly very dangerous, really violent, could have ended up with any one of us women having our lives taken. And all over placards, there's talking about me dying and being stomped on and exterminated and all of these things. And that shouldn't have even been allowed at all. But lots of nations have been allowing this, whether it's how we protest against world leaders when they come here, more likely to protest Trump than they were somebody who's in a sort of a theo-fascistic kind of authoritarian country. There's something really bizarre going on, and none of it feels real.
A sort of hierarchy of different protests with perhaps uneven standards between all of that. From the sound of it,
and lies. I mean, the media in New Zealand is nuts. They just lied. I mean, they didn't exaggerate. They didn't just exaggerate. They didn't just extrapolate. They actually lied. They blurred my hand and pretended I was doing a white power signal. They whipped up. I mean, maybe there's no news in New Zealand. Who knows? But they whipped up a frenzy. I was trending in those areas, and I was on the news channels every single night with, serious politicians coming out and lying about me and saying that I was a really dangerous person, and never talking about really any of the issues that the women want to talk about in their countries, just sort of saying that I had these guilt by association relationships with a variety of people that I've never met, never talked to, I've got nothing to do with, and just whipping people up into this frenzy. It's a sight to behold.
You mentioned the women there. What do they tell you? And do they sort of compare your experiences with theirs and sort of comment on the kind of nature of women in political debate in Australia and New Zealand?
Yes. So there's already self-ID in most of Australia. They talk about the sexualisation of children, and I saw government literature where it described babies aged 0 to 2 having a sexuality, and talking about babies sort of touching their bodies, being sort of forming their sexual identity. It's truly the worst of everything. Is probably in our Fair Isles is Scotland, and it's worse in Australia and New Zealand than it is in Scotland, and Scotland is pretty bad.
I mean, I think there's often a sort of worldwide trend in these things where, it seemed for a long time like most Western democracies were pushing towards self-identification. And now perhaps in recent events, you see obviously the backlash to what was happening in Scotland with the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. You've seen the World Athletics Committee come out against sort of elite sport, transgender participation in that. It seems perhaps maybe that there's a kind of pushback or a sort of change in the national mood on these trends. Did you detect anything like that in Australia or New Zealand? Because it sounds as though it was very much the opposite.
Well, it's the same in every country, that it's this weird covert attack on policy before it ever spills out into the public discourse. And that's happened in Australia and New Zealand a lot worse. So nobody knows what's going on. And New Zealanders and Aussies, they are really, I'm not going to say apathetic because that makes them sound like they don't care, but everything's going to be great in Australia and New Zealand. Everything's fine. Everyone just likes each other and gets on. And so they were ripe, really, for this sort of authoritarian creep. Same in Canada, this authoritarian creep where they change all the policies, nobody knows what's going on, and then they just push this sort of coercive manipulation of the population. And most people are still thinking that a man who wants to enter a space, which some people might call a trans woman, I would call a man, but a man wanting to use women's spaces and pronouns and language, etc., a lot of people still think that is a really vulnerable member of the population who needs looking after and special sort of rights. And the truth is, it isn't a vulnerable member of a population that can have a mob of 2,000 people commit acts of violence against women and not even be condemned. That is not a vulnerable part of our population.
And how has this sort of impacted you? I mean, looking to the future, is it going to change how you conduct these tours, or how you think about them, or how you engage in the public space, or do you remain more resolute than ever? What's your kind of takeaways and lessons from the experiences you went through in Australia and New Zealand? Well,
I'm upping my own personal security, which is frankly expensive. So I'm upping my personal security. Plus, I'm just about to enter politics, and I'm going to go stand against Keir Starmer. So I'm going to be even more known. And I think the attacks upon me are going to be more vitriolic. So that's one thing I'm doing. I think unless we get really good agreements from police when I travel, so I'm supposed to go to Northern Ireland and Ireland. And now that they've upped the terrorism threat in Northern Ireland, I think that would be silly to put women at grave risk. So I won't be doing that. But, you know, I'm going to tell the police in this country that they absolutely have a duty to look after us. Otherwise, what we will do as women is we will stand against every single PCC and we will win. And we will ensure that the police actually look after women and that we're safe to speak in the streets of the United Kingdom.
Thank you for joining us, Posie. That's it for this week. If you enjoy Spectator TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.